Hello and good evening, everyone. We're getting started at 5:10 UFT time. My name is Huda Henry Riyad. I am representing the Woodsworth College Alumni Association Board. Tonight's event is a hybrid one and is going to be recorded as well. For those of you who are joining us through the live stream on YouTube, the technical team has enabled the live captioning. You can view the captions by enabling the CC function through settings at the right bottom corner of your screen. To get started, we commence by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on this land. It's our delight and honor that you're joining us tonight for the annual Saul Goldstein Memorial Lecture. The lecture is named after Saul Goldstein, a Woodsworth College student who graduated in 2004 at the age of 93. Mr. Goldstein received his Bachelor of Science degree with high distinction, majoring in psychology. With marks in 80s and 90s, he was on the Dean's list for academic excellence and has received another certificate for outstanding scholastic achievements. He lived a remarkable life, and his memory lives on. When Saul passed away in 2007, family and friends established this lecture series in his honor, and our sincere gratitude to the Goldstein family for their support and thoughtfulness in honoring Mr. Goldstein's memory this way. On the agenda for tonight, we will hear a lecture from Karen Kuby titled Architecture and Global Fight for Housing Justice. A Q&A session will follow the lecture, and for our audience attending online, please submit your comments, questions in the chat comments, and we will include them. The online chat will be moderated by my fellow board director, Laura Martin. I'm really excited to be here tonight and to introduce tonight's speaker. Karen Kuby is an assistant professor at John Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design here at UFT, holding degrees in architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, and Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Karen began her career as a designer of below-market housing. Karen also is an urbanist specializing in house design and social justice. She is the editor of Housing and Intervention, Architecture Towards Social Equity, published in Architecture Design in 2018. She served as the first executive director for the Institute for Public Architecture in New York. Currently, Karen convenes the American Institute for Architects' Right to Housing Working Group. We're honored to have you among us and eager to hear your lecture on such a timely topic, architecture and the global fight for housing justice. Karen, the floor is yours.
Architects need to envision more just futures, and there is no more urgent issue than housing justice. We need to work in solidarity with allies, and we need to organize. So thank you so much to the Woodsworth College Alumni Association for inviting me today and for the beautiful introduction just now. And specifically, I want to thank Barbara Track and Carolyn Peralta, who have been incredibly helpful in inviting me and organizing today. So I'm Karen Kuby. I am new. I've been in Toronto. I've been in Canada for about 6 months now. I'm a new assistant professor at Daniels, the architecture school, as this was just mentioned. And my position specifically focuses on housing justice, which is a match made in heaven. So I'd love to know. So I said that it's very important for architects to work in solidarity with allies. I think there are some allies in the room. And my goal today is to introduce myself a little bit in a new city. And a dream would be maybe in a couple of years that I'll have had the chance to work with some people in the room. So I know that there are some architecture students in the room. Raise your hand if you're an architecture student. Okay, so we have 2, 3. Oh, they're like this. Anyway, okay, how about people from the Woodsworth College Alumni Association? Okay, nice, some alumni. How about people working in architecture broadly? Great, working with architects. Do you work with architects? I know there's at least one person working in health. Is anyone working in health? How about art? I know there's at least one person working in art. Okay, these are so shy, but, so who did I not mention? Did anyone not fall in any of those categories? Yes?
You need to find out how many of the 150,000 people in Toronto have housing.
Yes.
That don't get it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so the comment for people online is that I need to find out how many people in Toronto do not have housing. And that is helpful because, full disclosure, I need to find out a lot about housing in Toronto. I'm not going to speak except for maybe one slide about this city because you know a lot more at this moment than I do, but I'm learning, I'm eager to learn from you and to have more of those answers when I give later talks. So what is housing justice? We have different definitions, and I like to rely on people who are closest to the issue. So just this past weekend at Daniels, there was a Community Land Trust Summit, and from Whitehorse Community Land Trust, there was this beautiful statement that we need beautiful, sustainable housing designed and built by and for Northerners, community-led and affordable forever. So that's one recent definition that I really loved of housing justice. Looking at somewhere like Uruguay, there's a long history of cooperative housing. What's amazing, so that means half a century of experiences is the subtitle there. What's really notable here is that cooperative housing is so ingrained in the culture, there are strong laws at the federal level, that the concept of cooperative housing actually survived the dictatorship. It started before, and it survived because it was strong not only in law, but in culture. Looking at what housing justice looks like in a place like Sao Paulo, where there are not a lot of resources, but there are very strong laws in favor of tenants. And so this is an occupation, 9 de Julio, which means 9th of July, as you might have guessed, organized by, this means like movement without roof, or homeless movement of the center. So this is led by formerly homeless women of color. They've occupied a building, and I've never seen anything closer to utopia. This is a communal kitchen, a garden. They have, social services on site. They do weekly big cookouts. It's amazing. Actually, I have 2 of these kitchens, communal kitchens, to feed everyone. And then, so I'm from the United States. I've spent the last 20 years in New York. Before that, I'm from California. That's why I'm nice. So something that I've really, looked at in my work recently is from the States is the Homes Guarantee. So this is a national platform put together by a coalition of 1 million lower-income people of color under the umbrella of People's Action. And the Homes Guarantee, like a lot of this work, is saying it's not enough to tinker at the edges, which I would say describes a lot of work in housing in many places. We must solve this issue. Specifically, their proposal is to build or renovate 12 million units of green social housing. Social housing meaning community-controlled and permanently affordable, with the goal of ending homelessness. Again, not just tinkering around, but ending homelessness, ending the housing crisis. And then, of course, looking globally, this is a slide made by a lawyer, which is why lawyers and designers need to work together. But anyway, so he's an amazing lawyer. But so looking at the human right to housing globally, right, as defined by the UN, we know that the right to housing is not just a slogan. Adequate housing has been recognized since the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I'm very eager to learn more about what the right to housing means and doesn't mean here. So it comes with 7 specific elements, right? Security of tenure, availability of services, affordability, habitability, accessibility for all, location, and cultural adequacy. So, of course, housing is a political problem. Of course, housing is a giant economic problem. I believe it's also an architectural problem, and we need to address it. And you know, I decided to delete, I had a graph of housing prices in Toronto, but I thought that might be a bit triggering. You know, I'm sure many people in this room are not, you know, are living farther away than they want to, living in smaller apartments in more crowded conditions. You know, we know that the housing crisis is huge right now, but the so-called housing shortage is not something peculiar to the present. On the contrary, all oppressed classes in all periods suffered more or less uniformly from it. So to say that we call this a housing crisis now because it's gotten to a scale where it's reaching many in the middle class, but it's unfortunately an issue always for poorer people. And this is not a new quote. This is, I thought, in an academic setting, I should maybe cite Engels, Frederick Engels, The Housing Question from 1872. So the framework I use to think about how design can address these larger social issues is a framework of spatial justice. So what is spatial justice? The person who coined the term is Ed Soja. So in Speaking Spatial Justice, Edward Soja argues that justice has a geography and that the equitable distribution of resources, services, and access is a basic human right. So you can see parallels with the right to housing. So he's the person who coined this. I usually talk about it in a sort of simpler way. Spatial justice is how social justice manifests, or not, in the built environment. And I think it's really exciting that there's so much work going on in this field now. These are some, on the right is Soja, on the left, 3 examples of newer scholarship. Toni Griffin from the Justity Lab at Harvard. You can see a poster that she's produced through years of global sort of convenings where she brings people together from different communities to ask them, what does justice look like to you in the built environment? And coming up with these different words, acceptance, aspiration, et cetera, and then if you zoom into the poster, more details. And her idea, which I believe in, is that there's not one definition, but each community needs to define this for themselves in different projects. Then Interborough Partners, a really important book, Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion. Dana Cuff has a new book on the topic. She's out at UCLA. I'll talk about her later in the lecture. Architectures of Spatial Justice. So really important work, and I had the chance to do a fellowship specifically on spatial justice at the University of Oregon. This on the left is a convening I organized with students and professors on this question, and before that, I had the chance to co-lead a series of 8 podcasts on the question of can design education promote social justice. So just a little bit about my research, which emerges from my experience as a designer of below-market housing. Maybe some of you in the audience know about this. You know, there was a moment where, you know, I love the work, I love the firm I worked with. Curtis & Ginsburg is doing phenomenal work. And sometimes it feels, by the time a project gets to an architect's office, sometimes it feels like you're just, you know, you're deciding what color vinyl tile. There's so many decisions that are made. They do great work. I just want to say that one more time. However, it can be frustrating thinking about all of the decisions that are made before a project comes to a firm. So I've shifted my work since that experience to work in other elements of architecture, to shift systems or to think about systems. So, on to the book that was referenced in the introduction, Housing as Intervention Architecture Towards Social Equity. Housing's primary position in our lives, economies, and the built environment makes it a natural site of intervention in the complex fight against systemic injustices. So this was a chance to collaborate with amazing people, bringing together commissioning 17 essays from across the world, looking at these questions of social equity. And I asked each of the writers, architects, historians, people working very closely with communities, 2 questions. 1, how can housing projects and the design processes behind them be interventions towards greater social equity? And 2, more of a question for the profession, in the face of persistent social inequities worldwide, how can architects make a meaningful contribution? So someone asked me, okay, what's different about architecture when we think about how it might specifically address social equity. What is different from that and what we might find in more typical forms of practice? So we found, in the research, found about 3 categories. One was collaborative approaches, so looking at ways that architects are working on the left. This is ISA Architects from Philadelphia, working closely with public health researchers to create a toolkit looking at what different design moves might do in terms of public health impacts, collectively and individually, mental and physical. So you're seeing the icons indicate what different design moves might produce in terms of those impacts. Going across the pond to London, this is a scheme by Kusevich Carson Architects, and I could talk all day about how beautiful it is. I think it is. And instead, I want to focus on the collaborative approaches behind their work, specifically working extremely closely with the residents of council housing, which is the London form of social housing that was not built for many decades recently, and then after the financial crash, long story short, they started building it again. And specifically, these are scenarios where the residents are not even speaking to the council in some cases. So the idea of community engagement is not a nice extra thing to do, but it's something that was necessary. Different firms had been they hadn't been able to cut it, right? And so only through real engagement with the residents were the architects able to move forward and the project move forward, and specifically things like bringing residents to the brick factory to help select bricks. And ask them questions about what they need. So from collaborative approaches to new forms of housing, of course, housing doesn't change that much compared to some other types of architecture, and sometimes what's old is new again. Is that how that phrase goes? So looking at accessory dwelling units, you might call them granny flats. There's laneway houses here. And on the left, this is from Dana Cuff, the same person who wrote Architecture of Spatial Justice. So she's at University of California, Los Angeles, leading City Lab, and has been working on accessory dwelling units for over a decade, looking at architectural pilot projects, urban schemes, et cetera. And what's exciting is that she was actually one of the authors, along with Karen Chappell, who's now here at the School of Cities, of statewide legislation that passed in 2017 in California to make it easier to build accessory dwelling units. So why does this relate to social equity? Because looking at this as a potential form of so-called natural, affordable housing that can bring in newcomers to a neighborhood without taking over new land and contribute to more diverse neighborhoods in terms of economics and racial makeup. Of course, we know that the story of that has been more complicated than might have been thought back in 2016 or 17, and Cuff explores this in her new book. On the right is from an essay by Antra Steinmuller and Raj Bhatia out of San Francisco, California. This is an example by NHGM Architects proposed for Seoul, Korea. So this is an example of the spatial commons is what Bhatia and Steinmuller call it, targeting the precariat, which they define as, many of us in the room probably, people who have just enough money to live in the city, but if they miss a paycheck, they couldn't afford it. And so looking at the relationship between privacy and community in the housing, and also how the housing relates to the city. So from new forms of housing to a new kind of architect. So looking at different forms in the profession. So on the left, we're in Kigali in Rwanda, where there are big issues of, massive and very rapid urbanization and supply chain issues, where many construction materials come from abroad, which comes with expense, and also means that money is going elsewhere. So this is Fatou Dié, who wrote this piece and has been working in Rwanda for a long time, talks about this less as architecture and more as a framework. So this is a design based on designing the supply chain. So designing housing that can be built using bricks made by small and medium businesses. And so she says she has what she calls, she says, well, it's not enough to be a normal architect. She's talked about like the new knowledge she had to gain, and what she calls being an architect / environmental urbanist, planner, value chain expert. That's what she says is necessary in this context. And it's wild. This came out just a few years ago, and the ribbon cutting for the first one was a few years ago, and this is open source. So there are now thousands of these because there are all these small factories that have started up. The designs for this prototype are open source, and so there are thousands of these now. It's very exciting. And on the right is an example in the book from Toronto. So thinking about a new kind of architect, looking at the work of Graham Stewart, now with ERA Architects. So for the architecture students in the house, this is research that he started when he was a student at Daniels. And then as soon as he got out, was in conversation with community groups and politicians, so looking at tower renewal. And so I bring this up as options for architects not to sit and twiddle our thumbs until a rich developer comes our way, but to produce speculative projects in conversation with community and see how those can be realized. So I think the book In Defense of Housing is a really important reference for me. David Madden and the late Peter Marcuse say the built form of housing has always been seen as a tangible visual reflection of the organization of society. It reveals existing class structure and power relationships, but the next one's for the designers. But it has also long been a vehicle for imagining alternative social orders. So that's kind of umbrella for all of this work and why I get up every day. Okay, 1 second. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly just to give you a sense of my work. As I mentioned, this is to introduce myself, so I've had the chance to curate some exhibitions, including this historical exhibition on low-rise, high-density housing. I did a project in Canada a while ago at CCA. I got to work on Utopia's Ghost. I do some writing. And then looking at creative practice, looking at working on housing and social justice in a community-engaged way through different methods. One is looking at just spaces. So sometimes co-designing speculative projects like this one, City as Living Room, which was exhibited at the Museum of the City of New York, that looked at an issue where only 17% of New York City households are nuclear families, but the majority of housing and housing laws are geared toward them. So this was a very fun project put together by Citizens Housing Planning Council and the Architecture League of New York, inviting architects together and asking us to break laws on purpose to show what kind of housing we could have with different laws. And this is a new idea for a new version. What would single-room occupancy look like today on the right? And then on the left is bringing together a few ideas at once. This was for the Bronx. Producing exhibitions in unexpected places. This is Living Room, Housing Works Build Housing. Making visible the work that an important organization that works with people with HIV/AIDS, what they do, and actually making visible what one of their housing units might look like next to a timeline of research we produced. And this was part of a big festival, so a lot of people were coming through to see that. And yes, mentioning, this all comes from real work in affordable housing, one of the projects I worked on when I was doing that. Also working with the government, editing different books, working on disaster housing in a regional way. And sorry, this is not housing, but I really like it. So I also had the chance to work with the health department in New York on a program called Mental Health by Design, where we went into 9 high-need high schools around the city, in each case turned a disused classroom into a wellness space, with wellness defined very specifically by the school. In this case, the school had a restorative justice initiative, and I wanted a space for that. And then a couple more on the left, a school entirely for students with special needs. On the right, a school in the Bronx. They said, okay, we are the birthplace of hip hop. Students really use music to release emotions. We want to have a music room. And so that was amazing because actually they just wanted a music booth. But I brought in an architect who's also a musician, and he said, I can just buy you a music, like, you don't need an architect for that. So we found some more money. They just bought an off-the-shelf booth and then created a whole music room. And all of this under the umbrella of community building, including my teaching, which I will have to leave to another talk. But you know, in my work with the Institute for Public Architecture, this is you know, a conversation bringing together public officials, local experts, architects, developer, and specifically, this was a total reset. Was a response to the then mayor, Bill de Blasio, declaring a total reset for public and affordable housing. But speaking of it really only in economic terms, how many are we gonna, in numbers, how many units are we gonna build? And there was basically no design in the proposal. So we asked our fellows to make proposals about how design could contribute. And what I'm very proud of, so you'll see, you know, this was in the space of affordable housing. It wasn't in a fancy museum somewhere. I love fancy museums too. But this was in the space of affordable housing as part of a larger exhibition before people moved in. And you know, we got big coverage in the Times, which is great. I don't really care about that. What I think is really important is that the proposals put forward by my fellows, Peterson Rich Office with Sagi Golan, were then reflected in the zoning that came out thereafter that had more nuance around parking. And then this all started for me, you know, a main moment where I started to think about the power of housing design in people's lives was in founding and organizing the New Housing New York competition, which was the first competition for sustainable and affordable housing. And I'm happy to say that that sounds really boring today, that like sustainable and affordable, of course. And I think I'm proud, I think we made a small contribution in making that boring because at the time, you know, sustainable designers and affordable housing designers were not in the same room, and many people thought, that's too expensive, you can't do that. So this is the resulting project from the competition, Via Verde, designed by Grimshaw and Datner, and this became a test case for active design guidelines and health equity through design. But you know, I think what's exciting is to be part of a much larger movement looking at these issues. This is the Design Justice Summit from a few years ago. I'm still waiting for the photo from the subsequent one that came this last summer in New Orleans. And then back in the day, when I was younger than almost everyone in this room, I had the chance to found Architecture for Humanity in New York. So I just want to show you one, you know, I've gone pretty quickly to give you kind of a broad sense of how I've approached housing justice and spatial justice through my work. I now want to take you through my latest speculative collaborative project to give one example of how this might manifest. And you'll note that I am but one name on a list of many names. So it was a pleasure to co-lead this project with architects Niraj Bhatia and Ignacio Galan in collaboration with a lot of people, including maybe most important, residents from West Oakland, a neighborhood in the San Francisco Bay Area. So our thesis here is that aging is not a problem to be solved. The problem is a range of barriers, physical, social, financial, and cultural, that make it difficult to grow older with dignity and in community. So, of course, aging is a machine. The machine is neoliberalism, and I'm sure all of us know older people who, you know, in their later years have limited options and might be isolated at home or in institutionalized forms of care. So in response to that, we are advocating for alternative housing and community development scenarios for aging that open up more options for care, increase access to the city, improve resource sharing, and strengthen community ties. So what I'm showing you is a photo from our installation at the Center for Architecture in New York. We were one of 4 multidisciplinary teams selected from across the country to respond to a prompt. This is in an exhibition called Reset Towards a New Commons. So we were responding to this idea of how do we create a new commons. And so our work is trying to do the opposite of just parachuting down as an architect with our own sort of disconnected ideas. Instead, we were very committed to building on historical and ongoing local initiatives. So for those who aren't familiar, West Oakland is a neighborhood in the San Francisco Bay Area, a diverse and majority Black neighborhood that has seen decades of disinvestment. And as a response to that, there's a phenomenal history there and in the larger Bay Area of civil rights work, anti-war protests, and different forms of coming together in community, and then importantly, the Center for Independent Living nearby in Berkeley. So we're really interested in that, and also doing a lot of historical and archival research. So we see on the right in the back a redlining map showing that this area was redlined, which means that it was difficult or impossible to get a loan for these areas, and that has long effects. And then in the image with the people standing in front of the bus, this is Seniors Against a Fearful Environment, a project of the Black Panthers, as just one example of a response to this, of people coming together. But this is not just old news. There is really phenomenal work happening now in this neighborhood, including with our partner, the East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation, or EVALDC, working on the project on the right, which takes a lot that's going to be developed and makes it into community hub in the interim. And then on the left is a project of the Black Liberation Walking Tour, and we collaborated with David Peters from the Black Liberation Walking Tour. And in our exhibition, instead of starting with a sort of generic neighborhood map, we started with a walk through the neighborhood with David, talking with people like Annette Miller, who successfully fought the banks to keep her home. So again, saying this is not new. These struggles and successes are ongoing, and our work is just to stitch things together and build on them. And speaking of building on them, we're proud of the engagement work we did in a short amount of time, working for 14 months, but that's not enough. And so what we did is build on decades of engagement work with our partners, and then augment that with our own engagement projects with seniors, letting students really lead these conversations. And maybe I'll pause here. This was a really interesting moment because, we were doing a lot of reading. We were reading the theorist Silvia Federici, who's really brilliant, looking at, cross-generational solidarity around these questions, but then realized very quickly that we were hearing the same things on the ground. So for instance, asking older people in West Oakland, what do you need? The first thing they say is, well, the kids need XYZ. So the intergenerational thinking comes not just from research, but from on-the-ground work. And then all 3 of us leading the project were teaching at the same time and finding ways to engage students in these processes. Our project always being a month or 2 ahead of the student project, and then showing how this shows up in the space, how we tried to produce a different kind of exhibition. So mixing up models for new interventions with historical work, off-the-shelf ideas, saying that could come all together. So you're seeing a custom-built table on the bottom, holding our models, research, et cetera, and on the top is a series of 7 ideas, 7 narratives, for how we think architecture might help contribute with many other fields to a more just future. So I'm going to show you, there were 7 scenes. I'm going to show you 3 of them. starting with number 5. So I mentioned how important the homes guarantee is to my work, and I think it's so important globally, I think. But how can we possibly imagine 12 million units of social housing? What does that? I can't imagine that. But what we did is ask, what would it mean to take that national framework and apply it in the neighborhood of West Oakland? And fast math says that that would be about 1,600 homes, and the model on the bottom right is showing real sites, mostly along San Pablo Avenue, the main drag, that are either empty or developable for other reasons, importantly without displacing residents. So producing a design idea that's also has an economic and political component, development without displacement, and you're also seeing here, this is San Pablo being redesigned to be much safer, primarily for older people, but also for everyone. Then I mentioned, I went last week to the Community Land Trust Summit here, which was so energizing. This is part of our set of proposals. So thinking about a West Oakland Community Land Trust, building on work similar to this that's already happening in the Bay Area, and thinking about a strategy for community-controlled housing. And then some of our schemes were more interior looking. So this is looking at a model for intergenerational housing. Something our aging experts said to us over and over again is you can't think about older people without also thinking about caregivers. And this is a scenario where caregivers can't afford to live in the Bay Area, and they're traveling very far. So thinking about intergenerational housing that brings people together, and of course caregivers have their own families and households, et cetera. So these being the sort of primary audiences, but this being for everyone, and having within it a mix of both more conventional apartments and more communal ways of living. So I said that my dream is to collaborate with some of the people in the audience in the coming years. So now I'm working on architecture and the right to housing across the Americas. This will just be a teaser. You're not going to see very much today. But thinking globally about the right to housing, and how places like Brazil, that I showed earlier, are real leaders in this. I've been working for a couple of years now. I started and convened this really energizing working group with the American Institute of Architects looking at the right to housing. So we've now had 2 years. We have 2 more. This is wrong. It's now November 6th and December 4th. But we've had 2 years now of free programs that are each looking at one of the 7 aspects of the right to housing, connecting it to real work, looking at what's going on the ground, and with real examples of how architecture and architects are addressing the right to housing, including, maybe to give an example, cultural adequacy is so important. So talking with indigenous designer Joseph Kunkel, working with Native Americans in New Mexico, and talking about how to produce housing that is more culturally adequate. He told us specifics about the design process that they engage in to ensure that local voices are much more present than they have been in really disconnected forms of housing that people have been subjected to before this. And building, right before coming to Toronto, I had the chance to do a Fulbright in Buenos Aires. So as soon as we, sometimes it takes a long time to do these edits. So we have a small project, Seeking Social Equity, from Argentina, that will come out, that I did in collaboration with students. Recently, this summer, had a School of Cities funded project, Architecture and Housing Justice in Mexico. It was very fun. You see how much fun we had on the right. So building on this work in the coming years. And I'll leave you with this quote from the beginning. Architects need to envision more just futures, and there is no more urgent issue than housing justice. We need to work in solidarity with allies, and we need to organize. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome to Toronto. We're really pleased that you're here. You tackle a complex and interesting topic, the fight for justice in housing. You provided us with an accessible talk, especially for those of us who are with a general interest in the topic. where we can perceive the role of architecture in justice for housing. I'm especially intrigued by your work looking at new ways to imagine housing and your focus on human-centric approaches for creating livable and dignified spaces. Certainly you have a distinctive outlook, and given your research in the area, we thank you again for sharing your expertise with us tonight. We look forward to seeing how your research will evolve in Canada. Moving on to the questions from the audience. Anybody who has a question, please raise your hand. And for everybody else who is joining us online, please type in your questions or comments, and we will handle them. So, Laura, you have something?
Is this on?
Yes.
Classic. Hi, I'm Laura Martin. I'm on the Woodsworth Alumni Executive Board, and I've had a 16-year career in real estate finance here in Canada. I'm very, very aware of our 5 million house deficit here. And I was wondering, I know you don't speak on behalf of the university. However, I was wondering that if you believe academic institutions should play a role in creating more housing, considering that they are a major pull for these international students who are paying fourfold what the average student pays.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yes, I do not speak for the university, but I can speak as someone coming from a college town. How about that? So I come from a college town called Davis, California, and home of UC Davis, University of California, Davis. And it's been really wild to see these fights, which and some successes. So I'm happy because my former high school choir mate was recently mayor and took me around an amazing tour of housing in Davis. And I think what's really great there is seeing a collaboration between Town and Gown University and the city, and seeing a range of solutions for housing what's there, a growing population of students. So some expansion there, it's an ag campus, so there's some farmland, and there's been some expansion and some exciting net zero developments produced by the university. And there have also been some new experiments in housing, much more dense housing than Davis has had before, that are produced on city land. So in that case, it's been interesting to see how the city and university have come together. Yes? Yes. So that was a question.
I'll just have to ask you to say it again because people won't
Okay.
and won't be able to hear it.
I was wondering about her work in New York and the housing lottery that they have there, where residents bid each year, I believe, for lower priced rent for places that they might not usually be able to afford, and not many people win this housing lottery, say, and if it is a sustainable thing in the long term, or if there's a way to adapt it to be better so it reaches more people that need the financial help.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. That came from an architecture student. And so it's even worse than that. Megan, right, was talking about people with lower incomes applying once a year for housing. In fact, it's even more than that. Every time there's a new development with a certain number of units of so-called affordable housing, and I say so-called because sometimes they're affordable only for people making more than $100,000 US. Anyway, that's a rabbit hole. But literally thousands of people will apply for 50 units in one building. And that's not great. And so I think what I was talking about at the beginning is the response to that. So that is, that's something that I think helps some people. I know some really great people who can afford to live in New York because they won the lottery. So that's amazing. But it doesn't help enough people, you're exactly right. And I think, there are other systems thinkers. Someone who comes to mind is Roseanne Haggerty, who's with Community Solutions, that looks at the system of provision of shelter and housing for people experiencing homelessness. This is all to say that the system has become, especially in a case like that, has become really ineffective, very laborious for people with lower incomes who are applying to 7 lotteries in a year. So that's why I think something like the Homes Guarantee, or looking at the right to housing, how it operates in Brazil, or looking at cooperatives in Uruguay, or looking at community land trusts in Canada, I think that what's exciting is looking at this system-level thinking, and then thinking about the fact that all of this housing needs to be designed. The process through which residents are engaged needs to be designed, and the system needs to be designed, right? So thinking about the role of architecture in those 3 areas.
One more question.
Hi, great talk, and I could have listened ever longer. I'm lucky enough to work in what I consider to be the most accessible and valuable piece of real estate in the city, which is the emergency department. And when I wonder, as someone who has worked there for some time now, it's become increasingly chaotic and violent, etc. And when I look to see the mental health spaces that you were able to be a part of in schools, and I wonder how long it will be before designers inside my hospital recognize if I'm supposed to deliver mental health advice to a person at times that really matter, or reclaim it when it's been taken away because of, you see something that's hard to watch. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to encourage people to pay attention to that space, because there's obviously attrition and economic cost to that. And then why has it taken so long? Why would it be one of the last places that people imagine as a shared space, that is available to anybody, at least in this city, in this country, right? And everyone deserves a spot there, whether they're against the wall and need a place to sleep or whatever. So, just, I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
No, thank you so much. That's a really important question. And, we know that emergency room spaces become de facto shelters for people who don't have proper housing. And I guess my gut reaction on the reason why there hasn't been more attention to design is that people think design is frivolous. People think that design is an extra. People think that design is just aesthetics. People think that that not everyone deserves good design. So I think those are some reasons why there hasn't been more attention. And I would think, I don't refuse a lot of things. I say yes to a lot of things. But I was once asked to judge a competition for wellness design where there was no client and it was just generic. And I said, no thanks, I'm busy. Because I came to believe very strongly through the work on mental health by design, the project you're referencing, where we were working closely with communities in different schools, I came to believe very strongly that wellness must be, just like housing design, looking at acoustic Carson, et cetera, must be designed with residents. I think that wellness must be defined by the communities being served. And we saw such a different definition of what each of these schools needed. These are all schools in the same city. They're all high-need schools, but they all had such different stories for what their students needed and what they imagined for the space, which we made much better by working with them as architects. So I would say that those are some of the myths that I'm fighting against. I'm fighting against the idea that design is an extra, that's just aesthetic, that it's just for rich people through this work. And I think you're totally right that this work needs to come into spaces like hospitals that that try to take care of everyone in society and should be more welcoming and more dignified.
One more question from a student as well.
Hello, thank you for your talk. You talked a lot about focus groups and the importance of creating conversations with communities in the process. I wanted to know your thoughts on how to create a successful focus group and what type of questions you ask these individuals in the community to make sure that you're getting the responses that you need and the responses that will be beneficial to the project.
Right, thank you. And your name is Riley, is that right? Thank you, Riley. So that's a really important question, and there are many people, devoting their full careers to engaged design and to engaged processes. So it's a complicated subject. I think, I don't know of any better reference than Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, where she talks about tokenism or different, I'm sure we've all been part of this. Someone says, I really want to know what you think. And you say, I think this. And they say, thanks very much. And they turn around and do something else, right? So I think building into the process strategies where you ensure that you make extremely clear how the process will ensure that what you're hearing in the room comes into the project, and then how you will be accountable. So maybe I'll give one example. In the New Housing New York competition, there were some things I think we did pretty well. One was working with the community group before we put out the request for qualifications and proposals, asking them what they needed, so that you could not get to it was a two-part, if you must know, it was a two-part competition where people put together qualifications, and then 5 teams were paid a stipend to produce design proposals. So that meant you could not win either stage without making sure that your design met the needs that we had heard from community members. So those were written into the brief to say, these are the criteria we're using. A second thing we did was, once we had 5 finalist teams, we had them directly in conversation with residents again. So they were bringing draft schemes to this meeting in direct conversation, so that there would be direct feedback. And then I guess one more thing is that after all this happened, I'm sure we've all seen also beautiful winning competition designs, and then the real thing looks nothing like it. So then there's this piece of ensuring that the winning thing gets built, and that was produced by this amazing roundtable, bringing together on a periodic basis representatives from each of the relevant city agencies with representatives from our steering group to help to problem solve and to push forward and achieve the quality that was produced in the end. So that's one example in a complicated issue of community engagement.
We have one very Engels-inspired question from YouTube, from Jewel. The question for Karen is, full enjoyment of human rights is fettered by affordability and availability of land, which are themselves functions of capital. Can housing justice be achieved in capitalism? $1 million question.
Oh my God, just a softball. Oh my God. Can I even, let's see, how am I gonna respond to that one? Well, here's how I'll respond. I think, the way that we thought about this in the context of my book is by inviting people to operate on inviting explorations of people operating on 2 registers. So on the one hand, I think it's massively important to look at the different things people are doing right now within our current system to do the best they can. And sometimes that's small tweaks to make things just a little bit better, to move us a little bit toward housing justice. So I think those things are massively important and need to be celebrated. And ISA Architects is maybe an example, right? They work so closely. I mean, they get things done. They've done so many projects in Philadelphia and around. It's like amazing. And then I think we also need to work toward, imagining alternative futures. That was I'm paraphrasing the quote from Madden and Marcuse. So, we've talked about there are different levels of systems that are producing inequality, and I think architects have a really important role to help to imagine alternative futures. So I really think we need to do both. Do what we can today, tomorrow, and also push toward the bigger picture.
Yes. Hello, Karen.
Hi.
So actually, I have two questions, if
Oh, my
I
goodness.
may. I'm going to make them very short. So the first one, maybe if you can share with us some of the lessons that you might have learned from experiences in the Global South, in Argentina, and especially in Mexico. If there are any strategies that could be reapplied, and I'm imagining of self-construction, for example, as a possibility for social justice. And the number two question is one regarding the reality, or let's say the honesty that we should be having as architects about the fact that we can never incorporate all of the wish of our users. First of all, it's hard to get all of the voices of everyone. There are certain people that will not be coming to meetings. But also, once we have all of these needs, some of the needs are competing with each other. And even if we try the best, there are constraints of budget. There are constraints of, like what was asked, what was mentioned here so rightly, that you didn't actually answer. They very, subtly avoided about the fact that it is the capitalist system is preventing us architects from doing many things. So I'm sorry, it's a long question, but let's say those are the two things, or the two key questions for me.
Sure. So thank you, Aziza, for those questions. So, a reason that I'm interested in the right to housing across the Americas is to deal with the myth that lessons come from the north and go to the south, and that's how it works. In fact, there are really important lessons that those of us in the US and Canada need to learn. We're going to be publishing soon some stuff from Mexico, but one example is Cooperativa Palo Alto, which is the oldest cooperative in Mexico City. It's been around for 50 years. There's an amazing article recently in Places. So this is an example. Actually, there was an architect from Uruguay who came over and was helping to set this up, and so it's very beautifully designed, and there are really important stories about women-led construction and thinking about how that relates to design. I think an unfortunate scenario is that this isn't a surprise to anyone that there are more and more encampments in places like the US and Canada, and so one of my main aims in doing a Fulbright in Argentina was to learn from a place that unfortunately has a lot more experience working with long-term informal settlements in the form of what's called villas there. So I learned a lot about very careful engagement. I think what was really interesting is there were two major villas remediation projects that I was visiting, and one of them had won a global award, and that was not the best one, because when you get there, you see, these things can be spun, and it's a little hard to tell what's actually quality. And so I think an important lesson was everyone in town knew that the engagement piece had been much more thorough and authentic in one of the villas, where specifically they were doing interventions in the villa and the informal settlement, and also they were building next door new social housing and having a system where people could move with their whole family from a crowded home in the villa into separate apartments next to each other in the new housing. So I had mate with someone who had just moved like a few weeks earlier, and I said, and then we went by her home, which had been torn down, and I said, "Oh, is this a bittersweet moment for you?" She said, "No, I'm so much happier. I can be with my brother even though he's unemployed." Anyway, that's for another talk, but yes, many, many lessons. And then the question of competing needs and not being able to achieve all of the goals of every voice that you hear, not being able to achieve everything under capitalism. I think, I want to balance. Yes, community engagement is massively important. I think there's also, architecture training has a lot of benefits. There's a lot that architects bring as experts, and so I think, to be successful, also looking at what are the areas where expertise from our field and allied fields comes into play in helping to make some of those hard choices that are absolutely, absolutely correct.
Thank you, Karen. It seems that the question can go on and on. One last question. Okay.
I think you said that 4 times.
All right. I am Saul Jallo. I work for the City of Toronto and the Shelter Support and Housing Administration. I just want to ask, what solution will you provide to the City of Toronto, regarding the housing crisis right now?
Yeah, thanks so much. I am too new. I want to be clear, I do not have enough information to say this is what the City of Toronto should do. I think what I'd like to point to is what we're seeing from around the world and also in Canada with things like community land trusts, including at least 3 really amazing ones in this city. So I hope that Toronto can work in the ways that we've been talking about today to think about systems level change and change that is not going to just work at the margins, but is really going to end the housing crisis. So those are some things I'm thinking about, and maybe in a couple of years I'll have more specific ideas for Toronto.
And we look forward to hearing.
Okay, great. See you in 2 years.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. For the sake of time.
Thank you.
Just as a token of our appreciation from the college, thank you so much again. Really appreciate it. And for closing remarks, my fellow director, Meena Rambali, is going to be giving those remarks. Thank you, everybody, again.
Wow. This has been an educational evening, especially on the right for social housing. Karen, on behalf of Woodsworth College and our Alumni Association, we would like to express our utmost and sincere gratitude to this insightful discussion. I would like to thank all of our guests tonight joining us in person and online. If this is the first time you're joining one of our events, we hope you will join us again. Please check our website, our Woodsworth College webpage for future events. We have 3 upcoming events in November with various topics. The inaugural David Lewis Lecture on November 1st will feature Marshall Gans, who is an expert on leadership, strategy, and organization in social movements, civic associations, labor unions, and politics. The next event is on November 2nd, featuring the 25th Annual Edwards Memorial Lecture by Mary Bosworth. Her lecture is titled, What to Make of Border Violence. And our 3rd event is in November 16th with Mark Chignell lecturing on challenges and transformation of human-AI interactions in healthcare and cybersecurity. So, interesting wide range of topics. Please register and save your spots. We look forward to seeing you in our next events. I would also like to take this opportunity to express our sincere thanks to Carolyn Peralta, the Alumni Development Officer at Woodsworth College, and the amazing staff at Woodsworth College for organizing this fantastic event. Also, thanks to campus events, Tristan and Jeff, our technical support tonight, for smoothly managing everything in the background. Before saying goodbye, I would like to mention that we'll be sending out a short survey in the coming days, and it will be helpful. And you will help us immensely if you take a minute to fill it out. We would love to hear from you to better tailor our future events. So that concludes our evening. Thanks, everyone, and good night to our online audience. For everyone here, please join us for some refreshments, and we hope you can stay a bit to mingle. Thank you.